on Access to Inspiration, I'm talking to Chris Phin, Head of Podcasts at DC Thomson's The Publishers. Now, he could be described as a real-life hero, having recently picked up the Podcast Publisher Hero of the Year award. So welcome, Chris.
Hi, Sue. Thank you so much for inviting me.
What was it like then to go up on stage and pick up a Hero of the Year award? That must have been something.
It was surreal and very odd. I mean, we didn't know that award existed. So this was the inaugural Publisher Podcast Award, which was started by a team of people behind the Media Voices podcast to recognise the work that professional publishers and independent publishers, all the way down to like one-person bands, are doing with podcasting. So it's an award specifically for folk in the sort of media industry. And there's a whole bunch of categories, as you'd expect, but we didn't expect there to be this Publisher Hero of the Year award. At the point at which they started talking about this award that was unannounced, I was actually composing a tweet. I wasn't paying attention. And then I got the award, which was lovely because it was an award for somebody in the industry who is, shaping best practice and being enthusiastic and sharing stuff that are beneficial to my company's workflow practices. It was very, very warm and lovely to be recognised for that.
Well, it's great that we're speaking today because I'm sure there's a lot you can share with our listeners about what's happening in the world of podcasting. So we'll come on to that in a little bit. When I then began to discover a bit more about you, Chris, I read on your LinkedIn profile that one of your contacts had said this quote: "I don't ever think I've described a work colleague as inspirational, but I can think of few other words that better fit Chris." So that really made me curious because our podcast is about inspiration. So what do you think makes you inspirational to other people?
It's very hard to understand what about oneself. It's really hard to take a good sort of objective view of yourself, really. That was a comment left on my LinkedIn by a former colleague, Paul Hudson. So I can only quote from what was in the rest of that, which was about enthusiasm and curiosity and indefatigability, a desire to keep working, keep doing good stuff. And that's definitely true.
Thinking about the word inspiration, who inspires you, Chris?
The answer that we've kind of come to expect, and not from your podcast, obviously, Sue, but in broader media, the answers we expect are sporting heroes and Nelson, or, it's these kind of semi-mythic figures. But for me, it's an indefatigability thing. It's people who get knocked down and come back fighting, or who are brave in how they conduct their personal lives. There are people like my wife who is very whole raft of challenges in her life, but has really kept punching. I've got trans friends who have gone through a very difficult time of it, but keep pushing, keep moving forward, and keep putting, in those situations, it's very hard to stay positive, but they keep putting love and creativity out into the world.
It's about a kind of set of values, perhaps, traits of personality that are the things that really inspire you. And I'm sure that during your work career, which I'd like to find out a little bit more about now, that you've had challenging times perhaps yourself, you've had great opportunities, pivot moments that have taken you into new places. So tell us a little bit more about what's been your career journey to land up doing podcasting.
So I've been in magazine publishing all my professional career, and that was certainly not planned. I did a degree in graphic design and had every intention of going into some sort of design field. But I was always interested in tech and computers, and Apple tech in particular. The summer after I graduated from university, I was reading a magazine that I liked and subscribed to called Mac User, and saw that they were advertising for a sort of menial entry-level position on the magazine. Applied, and that's kind of the start of it. And that took me to London, and I lived there for 5 years. I then got the opportunity to work on a rival magazine in Bath, and I worked there for 7 years. And then I got a little disillusioned and threw my toys out the pram and left and went self-employed, which in these current trying circumstances gives me a little bit of a head start because I have worked from home for 18 months for a period. So I have some experience of that, as we all know, are having to build. I'd never really intended to work freelance. I like having a salary. I like being part of a company, part of a team. But when I left my previous job, I did just leave it. I didn't leave to go and do something else. It was just no, I've had enough of this, I'm going to leave. And I actually found that I quite enjoyed freelancing, and I enjoyed the flexibility once I sort of embraced it and lent into it. And I enjoyed the kind of variety of work I was doing. And I might well still be doing that were it not for the fact that DC Thomson reached out to me to bring me up to Scotland to head up a business unit within the company here, one that they'd acquired a few years before. That for a little while, and then restructured that team so that it blended into another part of the team, which left me at a bit of a loose end. And the company very generously said, take some time and have a think about the things you could do to help out in the company, because we realised you've got some useful skills. When we circled back round in that conversation to, okay, so what are you actually going to do? I suggested at that point that we should introduce some kind of podcast channel within DC Thomson. And I'm very fortunate that my boss, our chief exec, who said yes to that suggestion, he himself loves podcasts. So I didn't have to convince somebody of what podcasts are, why they're good. So that was a real stroke of luck that Mike sort of went, oh yeah, podcasts are great. I've been thinking about this for a while. We definitely should be doing something in that space. So go away and create that. And that was a little over a year ago. And in that time, we've had about 100,000 downloads across the portfolio. We have 8 shows with more in development. And it's been an amazing experience working right across the portfolio of titles we have at DC Thomson.
So it sounds like you've created your own job. And I'm imagining then that with that interest in technology and your insatiable curiosity that I get a sense that you have, you're able to combine those two things in what sounds like the dream job.
I'm having an absolute ball. I really am. It's a great chance to build these workflows and build this best practice and skill up. I personally had a little whiskey podcast called Scotch that sort of sporadically goes into deep hibernation for years at a time, and then I sort of revive it every now and then. So I've done a little bit of that, and I'm a big consumer of podcasts, but I hadn't done any serious audio production, audio engineering work before. That was great. And the first time you load up a professional audio workstation like Audition from Adobe, which is what we use, it's terrifying because it's a very complicated tool to look at. And there certainly was a period of a few weeks where it felt quite overwhelming. But now that we have those workflows in place, hitherto, before everyone started working from home due to the coronavirus, the workflows for some of our podcasts were very, very quick. They could be up within about 10 minutes of finishing editing, because we were sort of marking points to edit during the recording. So we just had to jump in and do those bits. There was templates, there's presets, and it was a slick process. And I get really excited by that. I get really excited by how I can do some hard work up front so that the deliverables become much easier as we go forward. And so that the teams I work with across our newspaper, magazine, and radio divisions within DC Thomson, that they don't have a huge ask on them. They almost literally just show up, talk for 20 minutes and then leave, and I can facilitate them to produce some really good work. And I'm doing stuff in the background. We're working with the teams to make sure they understand good radio technique, and they're being encouraged to be informal, and we're doing a lot of producery stuff behind the scenes, but that tails off as the teams lean into it. That hand-holding, if you like, really tails off, and they can be much more self-starting.
So you're really making it easy for people within the group to turn up and give of their best work because you've put up a lot of upfront work yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Now that everyone's working from home, we haven't missed a beat. We're still producing all of our podcasts. We're using a solution called Zencaster, which is similar to this Squadcast that you and I are using right now to record this podcast, where we can have our teams in different places. And we've ordered a couple of dozen microphones that are all sitting with them. Even in that context, I'm always on the call with them. I'm always there in the background to coach them, so if I can hear an audio fault coming through, or if I can see a point where there's a problem, I'll cut in and just take them back to the cue point and put those markers in, so when I come to edit, it all just sounds really, really slick.
It does sound like you've managed to grasp this technology very, very quickly and really be a pro at using it and producing podcasts. Who comes up with the ideas for the podcast series then? Is it down to you?
It's a mix. It will in some cases be me. In some cases it'll be driven by our commercial teams who can see some opportunities. In some cases it will come from the editorial teams themselves coming to me with some ideas, and then we'll do a bunch of development work. We'll definitely record some dummies, some pilots that are not for public consumption, but that are a kind of thinking out loud exercise. It's a way of reifying what you have in your mind. I struggle to this day to understand that people don't often have an awful lot of imagination, so they quite often need things to be concrete in front of them to understand what it is you're talking about. You can't just say, it'll be a podcast for 20 minutes that does this, 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 and this. They need to hear it. So producing those pilots is quite key, because it means that you can work through the sort of production, workflowy, logisticy headaches of it, but it also means you've got a final product that you can put in the ears of stakeholders or whoever it happens to be, so that they can listen to it and you can all react to it. It's a fascinating process. All the teams that I've worked with actual hosts have all gone through the process of being very nervous, very giggly, very tense as they start. And so you kind of have to trust that your audience is going to kind of grow with you, learn with you. Once they've got those kind of 3 or 4 episodes under their belt, they're really starting to lean into it and have fun with it and understand how, especially for a company like DC Thomson, we've got a lot of very important news brands, very respectable and respected news brands. And so there's quite a culture shift there in getting those journalists to deliver their stories in a more human and less polished way. It's certainly been true that a lot of the teams I've worked with have wanted almost to deliver 300 words of copy and then stop talking, because that's kind of the mindset and the rhythm that they're in. And so that's been a fun challenge to sort of break that down a little bit.
I almost get a sense that, as you're describing it, Chris, that podcasting brings a degree of authenticity that other forms of communication don't have.
Well, that's definitely true. That's one of the absolutely key things that podcasting can do. A byline in a newspaper or in a magazine is not just a few pixels on the screen. There's a person there. And at a time when trust in the media is challenged, and being able to bring people out from behind their keyboards and put them in front of a microphone, I think, is a really key thing. I used to work with a chap at Future called Grant Bremner, who was our head of TV there, who had a phrase that immediately I understood and I immediately adopted as my own, although I always credit him as I just have. And that was authentic but not amateur. You can't overslick and too highly produced, because people want that connection with an actual person. But by the same token, it can't be so ropey and rough around the edges that either you damage the perceived authority of the brand, or that you just genuinely produce something that is not pleasant to consume. So authentic but not amateur is a really good little mantra, I think. And there's something absolutely true with podcasting. So the studio, in inverted commas, that we have at DC Thomson, it's not a room, it is a flight case. So I have a Peli flight case with beautiful, I must say, beautiful custom cut foam inserts and trays and stuff for all my podcasting kit. But the point of that is that it can be deployed anywhere. And we deliberately use what are called dynamic microphones. So they reject a lot of the what we call room tones, so echoes and reverb all around you. So that even in really horrible audio environments, glass meeting rooms, you can still use them there. You can use them in the middle of a busy office. So the point there was to put together a mobile studio that we could deploy anywhere. Again, that sort of nimbleness of production, I think, is quite key. And being able to bring the studio to the teams that are working with them has been wonderful. I'm talking to you right now in one of the microphones that we use at DC Thomson, because it's not used just now because we're not using our main podcast studio. But you can hopefully hear that it sounds good.
Yeah, it's working pretty well in our conversation, I would say. Almost a really simple question, Chris. What do you think the purpose of a podcast is?
There's a lot of answers to that. I'm going to give you the one that knee-jerks into my brain as soon as you ask me the question, and it is to turn a dull activity good. So I'm thinking from the point of view of a podcast consumer. First and foremost, a podcast listener. The thing they do is turn dull activities good. So traditionally, the major consumption metric for a podcast is the commute. So most people have a sort of half hour to an hour long commute. Not anymore. They don't right the second as we record this, but generally they do. The thing about a podcast is, rather than thinking, oh, I've got to cram onto the tube and be pressed up against somebody's sweaty armpit for 40 minutes, what you might think is, oh great, there's a new episode of, I can't wait to go and listen to it. Similarly, if you're driving for work, or if you are doing the dishes, if you're doing housework, let's say, and listen to podcasts, because so it means that those times that I would ordinarily be dreading, I mean, dreading's strong, but low level dreading that are a chore, actually suddenly turn into somewhere where, and in fact, I can see it really happening right now, because I'm working from home and have been now for 3 weeks as we record this. I am not commuting, so my podcast consumption is way low, and I really miss them because I don't have that window of opportunity in my day to consume the podcast that I love.
So it sounds to me as if it's an activity that's done alongside something else rather than a discrete activity on its own.
Yeah, that's definitely true. The reason I love this medium so much is that there is literally no way of being more closely intimate with an audience. You listening to this podcast right now, the very good chances are you're listening to it on headphones. And if you are, the sound of my voice is currently emanating from the center of your skull. That's how it sounds to you. The voice is coming from the center of your skull. You cannot get closer to somebody for that. So you have this incredibly intimate relationship with an audience. And for a whole mess of reasons, that's an incredibly exciting thing.
As you say, it's about the closeness you get to the audience that's key for you, and it makes it really beneficial. Looking at your career as a journalist initially, and now as a producer of podcasts, and that sense of the ability to get in somebody's head in a way, my sense is there's a consistent theme that seems to be important for you around sharing, Chris. Whether it's sharing good practice, it's sharing know-how, and I can see you nodding as we're speaking here. Tell me a bit about what's important for you about sharing.
I think that's really true. I'm glad you picked up on it. I'm flattered you did. No man is an island. No person is an island. I think it's important that we do work as collaboratively as possible. And that doesn't mean to say you have to physically be proximate. You could collaborate over Slack or Zoom or everything else as everyone in the world is finding out. I guess a sort of responsibility to help everyone do their best work is key. It's funny, my wife at one point in her career was a teacher, and at the time she was a teacher, a lot of my time was spent writing tutorials on how to use tech, really. And it occurred to me, Damascene moment one day, that actually the job that she and I do are very similar. It's a teaching job, and it's not as all good, school teaching shouldn't be. It's not a didactic thing. It's not about do this, then this, then this, and it will all be all okay. It's an empowerment thing, and it's a conversation around giving people the knowledge and the tools they need to do a really good job. The world locks down under coronavirus. We're discovering the transformative role that tech can have. And I've seen countless examples on people's on social media of elderly relatives, this finally being the thing that pushes them to getting Skype set up on their phone or whatever. And I've seen very lovely outsider art instructions beside mobile phones of press this button to turn it on. When the screen looks like this, it's on. Tap this icon to start a video call or whatever. And at its best, it can be a very community building tool. And that all feeds into that sense I have. It's a good thing to share and to work together.
One of the things it was reminding me of, Chris, was earlier in our conversation about this idea of kindness. And another way of describing sharing might also be pay it forwards. When you've developed a great podcast, you found a good bit of tech, it's about your desire to pay it forward and then help the wider world get the benefit of that know-how as well.
I think as well, over the last maybe sort of 10 years, the broader narrative in society about privilege has begun to finally sink in with me. And I am a white, middle-class, cisgender male. I don't in the slightest claim to be a saint, and I fall far short of even my own ideals very often. But I do consciously make an effort to ensure that I can, I don't think I've ever turned down a student coming to me asking for help or to answer some questions. I've never, when somebody tweets me asking for help with something, I almost every single time gone out of my way to try and help. Given that I'm in such a privileged position, and I'm very fortunate to work for the company I work for, who has a very good long-term vision for stuff, and so gives me the space to create some interesting projects. And I'm insured from the vagaries of what's happening to the world just now by the fact that I've got a very good employer. All that privilege means that I am particularly conscious of the duty I have to share what I can and to help the people I can.
Give us your take on where you think the future of podcasting is heading.
It's heading in an odd place. It's at an inflection point just now. For a long time, podcasting started in this mid-2000s, early 2000s. And over that very short period of time, it just sort of almost for the entirety of that duration, it bimbled along, not doing very much. And it was very much to preserve the geeks. I count myself among them. But there's been massive explosions in popularity and huge increases in consumption and engagement, driven in part, I think, by big crossover shows like Serial. There's a true crime podcast that really did absolutely huge numbers. And also by the fact that, we're getting to a stage now where the sort of typical demographic of a podcast are completely digitally literate. They're more confused by the notion of broadcast TV schedules. All that growth has meant that it's an industry at a vulnerable part of its development because there are a lot of commercial interests in place. And one of the biggest ways those commercial interests are being reified is in the siloization of podcasting. So for most of podcasting history, the podcast directories, which for most of podcasting history was just Apple and some other ones that mirrored whatever Apple was doing, it was a completely free and open spec, as it still is, but you could submit any RSS feed to Apple and they would almost always just list it for free. But now we're seeing Spotify making investments of hundreds of millions of dollars into podcasting because the engagement metrics, i.e. how long people listen to podcasts for, are off the chart. You know, one of the most popular podcasts in the world is the Joe Rogan Experience, which regularly tops 2 hours, sometimes 3 hours long. Companies like Spotify are seeing the immense opportunity there, and they're trying to wall off a little bit of podcasting so that they can have their subscribers in there. You see sites like Luminary starting up as a paid for podcasting solution. You see Global making big moves in that direction as well. I fear, the business person in me thinks I can see the sense in this, and I'm thinking about this as well in my strategic thinking for DC Thomson. But the consumer in me doesn't like the idea of getting to a place with podcasting that we're at now with video, where you have to have half a dozen subscriptions of $3, $4, $5.99 a month in order to be able to watch anything. The disintermediation of that media consumption stuff for video is unpleasant. It's quite user hostile, I think. And I fear that we're in that place with podcasting. But to give you a happier answer to that, I think we're at a place where we are only just at the foothills of the popularity of podcasting. And people keep saying to me even now, oh, there's too many. How can we possibly differentiate ourselves? The opportunity here is vast. As people get switched on to podcasting, as working patterns change and as media consumption patterns change, that thing of having a really one-to-one relationship with your pals, of just sort of dropping into a conversation with people and learning something interesting is great. And I think the intimacy and authenticity, as you said, of the medium means that we are going to see not just continued explosive growth in the listening hours and the number of shows and the vibrancy of those shows, but we're going to see people doing things with a format that I can't even dream of just now, and I'm incredibly excited to see what those things are.
I have my final question, which is, what's your favourite podcast to listen to, Chris?
There are so many. One of the ones that still just gives me immense joy is a BBC podcast, and it is called Fortunately with Phin and Jane. And it's the sort of podcast that everybody thinks they can do and nobody can, because nobody else is Jane Garvey and Phin Glover. So it's an interview-based podcast, but the interview with a celeb of some kind is the second half, and the first half of the podcast is just Jane and Phin just sitting with coffee and chatting. But Phin Glover and Jane Garvey are consummate broadcasters with decades of experience between them, and they're also just charming and lovely. So take that as a recommendation if you haven't heard it. It's just a warm bath, a deeply calming balm in these most unsettling of days.
Wonderful. Well, you've left us in a very calm and peaceful place there, Chris, with your recommendation on that podcast. It's been lovely to speak to you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely my pleasure, Sue. Thank you so much again for inviting me.
Well, I hope you enjoyed hearing from Chris Phin, sharing his views about podcasting and where it might be heading in the future. The highlight for me was the quote that he shared about podcasting and how it should be authentic, not amateur. I hope you will agree that we are working towards this goal with our podcast series. What else did his words cause you to reflect on? Well, if you enjoyed Access to Inspiration, please take a moment to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you're using. And remember to tell your friends about us too, so that we can continue to reach more listeners. That's all from me, Sue Stockdale. Next week, I will be speaking to Amelia Lynn, co-founder and CEO of Saga, which helps families save the life stories of loved ones on voice audio. I hope you will join us then.